Welcome to the Horror Chronicles, a series of spine-chilling tales that will take you on a journey through the darkest corners of the supernatural realm. In this installment, prepare to be immersed in the chilling story of a haunted street known as Ghent. Tainted by a tragic past and plagued by a vengeful spirit, this seemingly ordinary neighborhood hides a sinister secret that will send shivers down your spine. Follow the terrifying experiences of two residents, Veronica and the narrator, as they encounter the relentless presence of a woman in white and delve into the dark mysteries that surround her. Brace yourself for a tale of fear, mystery, and a battle against an evil entity that threatens to consume their very souls. Short intro and let's get started. One Wednesday morning, my father came home very scared. As soon as my father entered, he turned on the TV so we could see the news and what was happening around the factory. It was only my mother and I at home. He told us he was in line when he heard a very loud noise that scared him. Immediately, the sirens of ambulances and firefighters began to blare. At the collector's office, they just announced they were going to close due to an accident near there, and everyone started running. My dad ran too, and came home as soon as possible and told us they didn't want to say what was happening, but they had better get out of danger and for everyone to return home. When my father arrived, very frightened, my mother and I had no idea what had happened. We had found out by private news that some eruptions occurred, mainly in the neighborhood of Analco, but it also affected other colonies, such as San Carlos, Atlas, and Las Conchas. The explosions occurred on April 22, 1992, as a result of the fuel explosion that opened the streets of these settlements, killing many people and wounding many others. The most affected street was the one in Ghent. I think it was the street where the largest number of deaths were recorded. Some bodies were found, but others were not found. Their relatives tried to find their loved ones to bury them, but to no avail. There were such these sad pictures, where mothers were looking for their children among the rubble. At the time this tragedy happened, I did not understand the impact of this fact. I was only 12 years old. When I got older, I saw things from another perspective. At that time, my house was far from this area, so there was no danger of new explosions, because paranoia appeared among the residents, as they thought that the sewers could explode at any moment, so all the neighbors started opening them, so that oxygen can enter and be ventilated, thus avoiding a possible explosion. When I got older, after I finished school, I started working for a company that was in that area. When I walked those streets, there were no traces of the damage done years ago, but the people who still lived in the place kept that tragedy lurking. By that date, they had already asked me for the apartment that I rented next to my partner, Veronica. And we both started working in the same company, and we were disappointed because we lived very comfortably in that place. But we had no choice. It was necessary to change residence. As we walked through the streets of Analco, we took the opportunity to look for an apartment or a house to rent, because we did not have much time to do so, because our working day took all the time from us. On one occasion, we were lucky enough to find a small house for rent. It was located on Kale de Ghent, close to our place of work. We immediately contacted the owner. He made an appointment for us to see the house, and if we agreed with the requirements, we could sign the contract. The house was not very big, but it had everything we needed. There were 2 rooms, one for my partner Veronica and the other for me. The rent seemed affordable. Without hesitation, we said yes. So soon we went to live in a new neighborhood, Analco. From the beginning, there was something in the environment that made me feel uncomfortable. as if there was a strange energy floating in the air. But since we were two girls and the apartment rent price was very good, we decided to ignore this feeling. We did not forget that several years ago there was a series of explosions in the area that caused dozens of deaths and injuries, and we both thought that perhaps over time, those feelings from the time of the accident may have remained in the air, but it seemed very strange to us, because we had previously gone through the street, and we never saw a thing. One night, something terrifying happened. While we were watching a movie in the living room, suddenly, all the lights went out and we heard a deafening noise. Veronica and I looked at each other in fear, not knowing what to do. And that's when we saw that the walls of the apartment started to shake, and the earth shifted from under our feet. At that moment, I remembered the outbursts of the past and thought something similar was happening. My heart was in my hands. I took Veronica's hand and we ran out of the apartment. Outside, the street was a complete mess. Neighbors were screaming and running in all directions. Some crying, some trying to contact their loved ones. Finally, everything returned to normal, and we realized that it was an earthquake. However, we could not shake the perception that something else was going on in that street. And after what had happened, we calmed down a bit, tried to unwind, and went back to our apartment, although we had difficulty sleeping in that night. As the early morning progressed, we began to hear a sound that filled us with horror, weeping and wailing coming from the street. At first, we thought they were neighbors afraid of the earthquake, and when we looked out the window, we saw that there was no one outside. However, the weeping and wailing became stronger and more desperate, as if someone was in great pain. Patty and I looked at each other anxiously, realizing something wasn't right on that street, but we just couldn't make sense of what was going on. We decided to go out and investigate, but when we opened the door of the apartment, we found a scene that left us paralyzed. Outside, the street was completely empty, but the light of the street lights flickered as if they were about to go out. The trees were moving without wind, and the most terrifying thing was that a figure suddenly appeared in the middle of the street. Woman in white was swaying from side to side, crying uncontrollably. We clung to each other, not knowing what to do. The woman slowly approached us, her face covered with her hair, and began to mutter something we could not understand. His voice was so heartbreaking that we had goosebumps pass through our bodies. At that moment, we realized something supernatural was going on, so we ran back to the apartment and locked the door, horrified by what we had just witnessed. The night was long and hard, with the unceasing sounds of weeping and wailing in the street, and from that night, the presence of the woman in white became more and more frequent in the street. More often than not, we would see her pacing back and forth, staring off into space with her arms outstretched, her crying louder and more mournful than ever, and neighbors beginning to comment on her presence in the area. At first, many refused to believe in the existence of ghosts, but with the passage of time, more and more people began to see the woman in white at dawn, and there were even cases of people claiming to have seen her in their own apartments, crying out in the darkness. I could not sleep at night. I would wake up startled by the wailing and screaming that could be heard in the street, and I would often look out the window to see if the woman in white was there. Although I was afraid of meeting her face to face, I couldn't help but feel a strange charm of her. One day, I decided I had to find out who that woman was and why she was torturing the people of Ghent streets, so I started talking to the neighbors. I asked them since they saw that woman. I was able to discover something that I was already assuming, because of the terrible tragedy that occurred due to the explosion of 1992, according to the old people. Since that time, the woman began to appear in the street. In the beginning, not everyone could see her. With the passage of time, she was visible to all people. It was said that the woman who was dressed in white was the ghost of one of the victims of the accident, who was still wandering in the street, seeking revenge for what happened to her. They do terrible things. I didn't know if I was going to believe these stories, but what was clear was that something strange was going on. I decided to investigate further, but what I found out was even more terrifying. There were several cases of people who mysteriously disappeared in the area, and it was rumored that the woman in white had something to do with these disappearances. The place had become dangerous, not only because of car parts being stolen, but because it had become a space full of mystery. I realized it was not wise for us to stay there, but we had nowhere else to live. The woman in white kept showing up at dawn. At least I tried to stay away from her, if I wanted something bad to happen to me. One summer night, the weather changed dramatically, and it started to rain heavily, and the rain was hitting the windows and walls with such force that it seemed as if the building was shaking as the storm intensified. The electricity started to break down, and finally, the light went out in all parts of the building, and darkness dominated everything, and the sound of the rain sounded deafening in the stillness of the night. In the darkness, strange things began to be heard, incomprehensible whispers, steps approaching and receding, and a woman's high-pitched laugh. Soon, everyone realized that the woman was on the street again. But this time, her presence was more sinister than ever. In the darkness, the white figure looked almost unreal, as if it was a ghost that faded and reappeared endlessly. Some of the neighbors began to tremble with fear, and others tried to ignore the woman's presence, but it was impossible. The laughter and lamentation that came from the ghostly figure was getting stronger, and the rain did not stop falling. The night became long and endless. Besides, the electricity did not return until dawn. It was a night to forget, but the image of the woman remained engraved in everyone's minds, and no one could explain what happened that night. And some neighbors decided to get out of the area, afraid of what they went through. Since that night, the woman's presence became more frequent, strange occurrences multiplied, and many wondered if the rain and darkness had unleashed something more sinister, which had been hiding for years. That woman became an urban legend in the area, and some claimed to have seen and heard her on the darkest and windiest nights. Despite the fear it continued to generate, people couldn't help but feel so fascinated by the ghostly figure. Some decided to investigate further about the events that took place on the streets of Ghent in the past. What they found was more disturbing than they had imagined. They discovered that the woman's story was more intertwined with events from the past than they thought, and that her presence could be an indication of something darker and more dangerous. Keep asking more, especially the seniors who have lived in the area for decades. I discovered something that I didn't know whether to believe. Maybe it was all a product of these people's imagination. They told me that when this terrible event happened, many people died from the explosions, including a young woman who was wearing a white dress. At the time of the accident, the woman's name was Cecilia, and she was found dead in the rubble, with an expression of fear on her face. According to accounts of the time, Cecilia was a very famous woman in the area, and her death was a tragedy for all who knew her. But what no one knew was that Cecilia was involved in dark and dangerous activities, and that he died because he had discovered secrets he should never have known. It gave me chills to know this fact, but I also doubted its veracity. I could not conceive how Cecilia had come from the afterlife to take revenge on those who had betrayed her. Though when she heard the wailing and the whispers and the laughter coming from the street, it began to make more sense. The more I searched, the deeper I delved into the dark secrets of that street. I realized that I had gotten myself into something dangerous, because the more information I got, the more mysterious and strange events began to happen in my apartment. I began to hear strange noises in the night, to see shadows moving all over the house, and to feel the presence of something I could not explain. Cecilia's presence moved from the street into our house. At first, the sense of her presence was barely perceptible, like a shadow moving across the room. But as time passed, her personality became stronger and more oppressive. My partner and I started noticing that we felt very tired and exhausted all the time, Our moods became somber and heavy. Our bodies felt heavy. At times, we were aware as if something was sucking us in. Every time we noticed that Cecilia's presence had become so intense that she seemed to want to suck our energy. It was necessary to do something to free ourselves from the influence of that woman, because I felt that I was starting to lose my capacity for conscience and will every day. So I started searching the internet on how to deal with spirits or supernatural existences. I found some remedies that I applied, but they didn't give me any results. They made Cecilia's spirits even more disturbed. When we spoke with a neighbor who worked in a local market, she told us of a more powerful ritual that promised to expel any evil entity from our home. We gathered all the necessary items. On the night of the full moon, we began the ritual, which was long and exhausting. We had to recite long prayers and make offerings to the protective spirits. As the ritual progressed, we felt the presence of the woman in white become more intense, filling the room with a thick and cold mist. It seemed as if someone was whispering something into our ear. After a while, everything was quiet. We stopped perceiving the evil sounds and shadows. For a while we thought it was all over, until we just sat on the sofa, as if we were waiting for something sudden to come. But it didn't happen like this. My partner and I thought it was all over. However, it wasn't that simple. At night, when everything was silent, the only thing that could be heard was the continuous sound of rain on the floor and the roar of lightning touching the floor. I started to hear noises again outside my room. I cautiously went out to tell my partner that something strange was going on. It wasn't necessary for her to do that. She heard too, and she was outside her room. We both looked at each other desperately. Suddenly, everything turned into a mess. The dishes started falling. The few things we started to move. The curtains moved as if there was a strong gust of wind. The only thing that occurred to me was to come closer to Veronica. She held me tight. I told him that it was necessary to get out of there. We managed to do it, but with great difficulty, because it seemed that some things were thrown directly at us. In fact, one of the plates that we managed to do hit Patty. Fortunately, we managed to get out. When we closed the door, we could hear how some things that were going around were hitting him. We both stayed for a few minutes, not knowing what to do. It was too late to call for help. It was raining hard. Besides, no one would have believed us. Desperate and tired, and we went to sit on the steps of the building. At least we didn't get wet there, and kept ourselves safe from the attacks that were happening inside the apartment. I don't know if it's just our luck, or if there really are angels who help and protect us, because our neighbor from upstairs, never before, came out and asked if everything was all right. We said no. Veronica started crying out of fear. We were really very afraid of what was happening in our apartment. She sat with us and asked us what we had done. We told her without details about the ritual. She explained to us that most likely we could not hide the appearance of the woman who was dressed in white, but on the contrary, we opened more gates, where other trapped spirits were able to get out. She also told us that this kind of ritual is not done without foreknowledge. That's why we only opened the gates, but didn't know how to close them. She told us she would try to help us, but she didn't know if it would work. We hugged her gratefully. The woman was about 40 years old, and there was a scar on her face that crossed her right cheekbone. So I went to her house for some things that would help guide the spirits that were in our apartment. Outside, it continued to rain heavily, with lightning suddenly brightening up the darkness. The neighbor came down from her apartment and told us she was going into her apartment. We were following her. She made a sign with her hand for us to stop. She preferred to go in alone. Inside our apartment, we could still hear things moving. I don't know how long it took her to tell you, but it took a long time. Suddenly, we stopped hearing the voices. Then our neighbor came out. She looked very tired. She told us it worked. The spirits left. It was the spirits that died on the day of the bombings. Those who had lived in that building and could not live. Without saying more, went upstairs and left. When she replied, I went after her, but I no longer saw the apartment I walked into. Patty spoke to me to tell me we could go into her apartment, and everything was silent, only a mess of things she was lying about, but she didn't come back. Another weird situation happened. We were so tired that we slept until the next day, and were awakened by the sunlight that filtered in through the window, and no longer saw the figure of the woman in white. At night, we went up to the other floor to look for the woman who helped us. We saw a neighbor who came out of her apartment. We asked her about it. Because we didn't know her name, and we described it to her, she told us we were wrong, as she only lives on the floor with her children, and the other apartment is occupied by an elderly couple. The neighbor, seeing our surprised face, asked us if she had a scar on her right cheek, to which we answered yes, and she told us that she was no longer alive. It had been a long time since she committed suicide. She lived in the same section that we occupied. I did not understand what the neighbor had told us, nor how we had received such help. We thought we would leave that apartment as soon as possible, but the event stopped, at least in our house. Because in the street, at night, still the voices and lamentations of people who died many years ago. Thank you for watching.